All right. Hello, everyone. Before we begin, I'll just share a couple of procedural things. You'll notice that the chat function has been disabled. However, throughout the presentation, you can use the Q&A feature to pose questions to our speaker, Femi, and you can also reach Jason and myself, who do tech support, through the Q&A as well. At the end of the survey, or at the end of the webinar, you will find that there's a survey that will be on your screen with a Q&A, and my colleague Jason will also put that in the chat for you. So please do just take a couple minutes at the end of the webinar to let us know what you thought and what you'd like to see for upcoming webinars. And lastly, you will notice that this webinar is being recorded. Shortly after the webinar, we will post it to our YouTube channel, where you can revisit this webinar and share it at any time. You can also look at any of our previous webinars and upcoming webinars as well, and I'll share the link in the chat momentarily. Without further ado, welcome to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversity's Webinar Wednesdays. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yursich. With Ava, I'm an early career researcher and lead on the webinar series alongside some amazing colleagues. I'm also the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children, housed in the School of Criminology at Simon Fraser University, and faculty in the Social Sciences at Capilano University. I'm joining you today from the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Coquitlam First Nation, and on behalf of AVA, which is national, I want to begin by acknowledging that we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. The focus of today's webinar is child sexual abuse and responding to disclosures. We are incredibly honored to welcome back Femi Akinsanya from Calgary Communities Against Sexual Abuse, or CASA. Femi is the co-director of the Training, Resource, and Education Center at CASA and a nonprofit and public sector leader advancing systemic change in the response to gender-based violence. With an educational background in psychology and health sciences and over 5 years of experience, she has built a career centered on advocacy, education, institutional partnerships, and sustainable system changes. Femi, welcome back, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone, from wherever you're joining us from. I'm right now on Treaty 7 land, otherwise known as Mohkinstsis and Calgary, Alberta. So again, welcome you all to today's training, where we'll be focusing on child sexual abuse and responding to disclosures. So in this hour, we hope to give you all instrumental skills around responding to disclosures, give you all base understanding of child sexual abuse, and how to connect with resources like CASA and your local sexual assault centers to enhance systemic change and to tackle the issue of child sexual abuse. Right. So Sarah gave a lovely land acknowledgement. And again, I am right now gathered on Treaty 7 territory. So that's where I'm joining you all from. And just again, continuing to honor in the Indigenous people and First People of this land as we go through this curriculum. So before we proceed, I'm going to give a short content warning. So in this presentation, we're not going to show anything or depict anything that's explicitly triggering, but we all know just having the conversation around sexual violence can be triggering and bring up feelings and emotions for a myriad of people. I like to say we're all connected to the issue of sexual violence on different scales and at different points. So continue to take care of yourself and check in on yourself if you do feel overwhelmed by the content. Again, we're not going to be depicting or showing anything that's explicit, but just again, merely having the conversation around sexual abuse, particularly child sexual abuse, can bring up feelings and emotions. And we have various information lines that you folks can access for further support if need be. All right, so in this hour, we hope to talk about facts around child sexual abuse. So we're going to give you particular prevalence studies. These are Alberta numbers, but again, these are transferable across the country and to different places that you may be joining us from today. So it's good to start and ground ourselves in the facts and the prevalences before we can really talk about what is next, is supporting disclosure and reporting, and really being a place of safety for the children and youth in your life. And lastly, we're going to end up with CASA services just to round out and talk more about local sexual assault centers and how they can, again, decrease silos and be part of the support network in combating child sexual abuse. So the first question is, what is child sexual abuse? So there's a lot of ways we describe child sexual abuse. People know it sometimes as molestation and all that kind of stuff, but in our work, we call it child sexual abuse. And it's something that, again, it is quite prevalent, but we have the tools and the tricks and the resources to tackle the issue at hand. So, what is child sexual abuse? So, child sexual abuse is when an older teen or adult looks at or touches the private part of a child's body, asks the child to look at or touch their private parts, shows child sexual images, or speaks to a child using child sexual or using sexual language. So again, we have a pretty broad definition that just goes beyond the physical. Usually when people think about the term of child sexual abuse or any kind of sexual violence, they think about just physical interaction, physical touch. But in this definition is very broad and very encompassing of various acts that quantifies as child sexual abuse. So this definition was taken from our licensed curriculum that we have at CASA called Who Do Tell. That curriculum has been around for over 25 years and is an educational program. And it really gives, again, people an approachable definition that is transferable, not only on a legal sense, but in an everyday sense. So it feels like tackling child sexual abuse is not this mountain. So again, I'm going to go over the definition one more time. So child sexual abuse is when an adult or an older teen looks at or touches the private parts of a child's body. So in our work, everything, the mouth is considered a private part as well. So we're thinking about the mouth and like genital regions and chest regions as considered as private part of someone's body, particularly a child's body. Again, the mouth is considered a private part. Next, the part of the definition is ask a child to look at or touch their private parts. So again, another person's private part is constitutes as child sexual abuse, or looking at a private part of another individual constitutes as child sexual abuse. Shows a child sexual images. So fun fact, the federal laws in Canada has changed as of January 1st of 2026 from using the term child pornography to child sexual abuse material. So that's actually some supplementary education you folks can engage in, and actually a federal law change that has been enacted as of January 1st of this year to further increase legislation that protects children against child sexual abuse images and child sexual abuse material. So we're no longer federally using the term child pornography. We're now using the term child sexual abuse material. And for sexual assault centers, we've been using that term for ages now. So this is not a new term in terms of service provision, but now the law has caught up and so denoted that child pornography is not the appropriate term to describe the harm and the violence that is being done to children and youth. So they changed the law and the language around it to child sexual abuse material. And last part of the definition, again, is speaks to a child using sexual language. So explicit language, pornographic language, those kind of things, again, denotes as child sexual abuse. And again, to remind folks, a child is anybody under the age of 18. So that includes mature minors. So again, I know with youth, it can get a bit confusing about, okay, where does being a child end and being a youth or a mature minor starts? But in terms of the law and service provision, anybody under the age of 18 constitutes being a child in this country. And again, this legislation covers that, and service provision also covers that as well. A good way to ground our understanding of child sexual abuse, and especially around, again, mature minors and consent particularly, is going over the age of consent and how the law sees it. So this is actually federal legislation. So this is how federally in Canada, we define consent amongst children and youth. So the first part is that anybody under the age of 12 cannot consent to any sexual activity. So there is no pure consent. Obviously, there's no consent with anybody older, definitely no consent with anybody over the age of 18. Consent to sexual activity cannot exist legally in Canada with anybody under the age of 8 or under the age of 12. Next, now we get into the ranges. So we have ranges in this country that allows for healthy sexual development. As we know, in these age groups, they're going through puberty, a lot of life changes. So in that, there is sexual exploration and sexual development that naturally happens. So we have a framework in the law that kind of gives, again, language and parameters to how consent can exist within certain age in that youth category. So between the ages of 12 to 13, they can consent to anybody over 2 years older than them minus 1 day. So a 12-year-old can consent to a 14-year-old minus 1 day. So in a legal framework, exact birthdays are very important. So again, we need to know if someone was born on July 1st, 1999 versus July 1st, 2000. Again, exact birthdays are very important when we're looking at this from this framework. So again, between the ages of 12 to 13, you can consent to up to 2 years older minus 1 day. Again, no one under the age of 12 can consent to any activity. So a 12-year-old cannot consent with a 10-year-old. Again, that falls away from the consent laws, but a 12-year-old can consent to a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old. And the 14-year-old is the threshold for a 12-year-old minus 1 day. And the threshold for a 13-year-old is a 15-year-old minus 1 day. Again, exact birthdays are very important when we talk about the legal framework of this conversation. Next is we have 14 to 15 years old. So within that age range, they can consent to someone that is up to 5 years older, again, minus 1 day. So legally within this framework, a 14-year-old can consent to a 19-year-old minus 1 day, and a 15-year-old can consent to a 20-year-old minus 1 day. Again, exact birthdays are very important in terms of this legal framework and understanding the consent laws. Again, this brings up a lot of emotions for people. Like, again, when you think about a 14-year-old and a 19-year-old, they're in two different places, life stages, even developmentally. This framework does not negate consent in terms of power and control and formal and informal positions of power. So again, if the 19-year-old is a 14-year-old's coach, that cannot be a consensual relationship, right? If the 15-year-old or if a 20-year-old is a 15-year-old's boss, that again takes out the element of consent, and that's no longer consensual. So again, power and control is still an element in this framework, but again, we give and some range in terms of sexual development and sexual exploration. And one thing I want to note is like the law isn't here to moralize this, right? When we deliver this to parents, educators, and teenagers, we also say that we understand that there's home values, cultural values, personal values that come into place, and the law does not override that, right? So you are still allowed to enact your own personal values where you feel that, okay, maybe 19-year-olds is too much for a 15-year-old. The law isn't here to moralize that. It's here to create a framework that takes in science, research, and where development is for that young person. Lastly, the last kind of element of the ages of consent is the legal age of consent is 16 years old. So anyone unless is 16-year-olds unless that person is in a position of power, trust, or authority. Again, these consent laws do not override positions of power, trust, and authority. So again, going back to the example of a 16-year-old, if they can consent to a 21-year-old, for example, but if that 21-year-old is their boss, their team lead, a coach, again, that's a position of trust, power, authority. If a 16-year-old is consenting to a 27-year-old, if that 27-year-old is in a position of power, trust, or authority, it takes out the consent element of it, and now we're going into child sexual abuse territory. So again, these are frameworks given by the law. These are not moral prescriptions that individuals will have. We always encourage people to lead with what your own personal values are around that, but these are the parameters that the law has, that the federal code has, to keep, again, in some give around healthy childhood development or healthy sexual development and the development and exploration that can happen within these age brackets. So again, just to reiterate, anyone under the age of 12 cannot consent to sexual activity at all. Those who are 16 and over can consent to anybody over the age of 18 unless the person is in a position of power, trust, and authority. Ages 12 to 13 have a 2-year age range. Ages 14 to 15 have a 5-year age range. And these are age ranges that go into the upper end and not the lower end. So a 14-year-old cannot consent to a 9-year-old because that 9-year-old is under the age of 12, and anybody under the age of 12 cannot consent to any sexual activity, whether peer or peer, older or younger. As per the law, as we have it right now under the Canadian Legal Code. So again, this is a framework to use. Exact birthdays are very important to that. And again, these are not frameworks that exist to moralize behaviors. This is again just to exist as a framework of legal prosecution in that sense.
Thanks.
All right. So to the next slide. Again, this is another way we use to show folks, especially in our education and training, is an easier way for people to conceptualize the concepts. Some people are more visual. So this is a graphic. So check marks is where you can legally give consent. X's is where you can't legally give consent. And the yellow O's are where exact birthdays are dependent. So again, it's a good framework on our CASA's website. So if you go to CASA's website, so CCASA, Calgary CASA's website, you can Google it, you can put in your URL. We have this in our resource hub. So you can download and print this and have this easily accessible for need be or in your professional practice. All right. We're going to go into the next section with is child sexual abuse myths versus facts. And in our work, we want to envision a world free of sexual violence. And the first way to do that is through primary prevention. And underscoring primary prevention is actually combating the myths and the facts, or myths and misconceptions, particularly that exist in society. A lot of what we call rape culture or sexual violence or violence culture is driven by a lot of myths and misconceptions that become some people's truth. So the first way to really tackle it and really go into that primary prevention lens and make sure these things don't really happen in the first place is knowing the appropriate facts to combat the myths and the misconceptions and hopefully change culture. So the first fact about child sexual abuse is that child sexual abuse happens in all communities. Again, there is no community, demographic, or type of person that is free for the happening of child sexual abuse to happen in their community. I know for a lot of people, they feel like, okay, there are people that there are protective factors. We can't completely negate power, privilege, oppressions, systemic violence, and all of those kind of things. But again, these is ubiquitous across all communities. So it shows that the responsibility and the steps that can use to change and combat sexual violence can happen in all communities, and it's just not one particular community or one particular type of person or type of people. It can be across socioeconomic lines, racial lines, religious lines, immigration lines. Again, no community across this globe is completely, unfortunately, unfree of child sexual abuse. It happens in all communities. Next is some Alberta stats. In Alberta, 1 in 3 children in Alberta have been sexually abused. So this was actually taken from a 2020 ASAS study. So in Alberta, ASAS, Alberta Association of Sexual Assault Center, is our provincial network. And they did a prevalence study in 2019 and it was published in 2020. So this is the most recent provincial statistics we have around sexual violence. And again, you can go to CASA's website or even ASAS's website to see that document. It's very comprehensive. It gives you a breakdown of all forms of sexual violence, but it really gives you good statistics around child sexual abuse. And again, the most recent data shows that 1 in 3 children in Alberta have been sexually abused. Again, this is a very jarring number, very large number. And one thing we have to remember that child sexual abuse and all forms of sexual violence is very underreported, whether it is to policing bodies or to academic studies. So this is actually just giving us a little snapshot into the real life range and prevalence of what this is. So most likely in your professional practice, in your life, in your day-to-day life, you're encountering people who have experienced child sexual abuse, who are currently experiencing child sexual abuse. So again, we're putting it in a way not to fearmonger people, but just to know exactly how prevalent this is, and just put a little bit of urgency into action in terms of what you can do as an individual professional, your impact in a workplace, or even your societal impacts in terms of like, supporting your local sexual assault centers or tapping into resources like AVA to get that continuing education to make sure you're equipped to respond appropriately, and even enact some changes around this issue. Next fact about child sexual abuse. And this is another one that's a really big one because it combats the stranger danger narrative, is that 88% of the time, the person that abuses a child is known to the child or the family. In this presentation, we don't have a lot of time to get really into the nitty-gritty about grooming, but 88% of the time, the person that is harming the child is known to that child. So it's not a stranger, it's not a completely unfamiliar face. There's already existing trust, rapport, and relationship with that person before they abuse the child. So again, this can be to the child, to the family, across the board. And this is again a way to combat the narrative that exists of stranger danger. And it's a very pervasive narrative that just not doesn't only exist in child sexual abuse, but across the conversation of sexual violence. So it's important to know that the vast majority of the time, it is someone that is known and trusted by the child or the child's family. Again, this is not a way for fear mongering. It's not a call to like, again, look over your shoulder type of thing, but it's a call to action to know that again, that there is change that can be made, but that change is actually more closely inner circle than those strangers over there. So that is that othering that happens. We want to call the action more in-house rather than there. So again, education is the first point of any kind of social change. So educating people around this is very important, and also understanding how to support not just the children that have been affected, but family members as well. Because again, we also know with child sexual abuse, there's a high prevalence and a high usage of grooming behavior. And not only the child is groomed, but oftentimes the family members are groomed as well, to have this 88% be the prevalence in terms of who's abusing the child in the household. Next fact about child sexual abuse is that children very rarely lie about child sexual abuse, right? People, even adults, very rarely lie. False reporting rates are around 2 to 8%. So 2 to 8% of the time, the police receives a false report around any form of sexual violence, right? That is very low, and we like to believe is actually closer to the 2% time percent rather than the 8%, but 2 to 8% of 100 is actually quite low statistics. So people very rarely lie about sexual abuse, and particularly children very rarely lie about the abuse and the child sexual abuse that they have experienced. And another thing to note is that 2 to 8% of the time of false reporting or lying is actually consistent with the amount of times people lie about other crimes. So burglaries, break and enters, physical assault, fraud. So again, when it comes to sexual violence, there's not a higher rate of false reporting or lies around it. It's consistent with how people would lie about any crime committed against them. So that's something to keep in mind. And one thing to note about children in terms of the lying part is that children are in a very integral time of their development. And that includes like memory consolidation and also their vocabulary, their ability to recall events, right? So that's something to note when a child takes something back. It may not be a lie, it may be where they are at developmentally. We have even had conversation about different abilities and neurodivergence in terms of communication and children and youth. And that's another topic within itself, but that's also something important to note. And children are stability seekers, right? Children seek stabilities. And even though children are in their most selfish era of their life, they're also looking out for other people's reactions. So sometimes they take back what they said, not because they're lying or not because the event didn't happen. they do it in the sense to regain stability because they're seeing the reactions and the fallout for the adults in the room. So from a protective standpoint, not just from themselves, from their family member, their caregivers, their loved ones, their sisters, their brothers, their cousins, they care and they don't want people to be mad. They don't want people to be sad. They don't want to be angry. They don't want mom and dad to fight. So they might recall the event. And for some people, that might land as they're lying. They're saying they're fabricating a situation. But there's, again, a lot of nuances and a lot of layers to why children take back events. And for some people, it might land as a lie, but people very rarely lie about abuse and child sexual abuse or any kind of sexual violence they've experienced. And particularly children never rarely lie about these events. So that's something to keep in mind and to combat some narratives about children fibbing or lying or fabricating incidents and information. We have to think about where they are developmentally, the intersectionality of abilities and neurodivergence, and the fact that children are just stability seekers. They're at the point in their life that they want things to be stable and predictable, right? And anything that destabilizes, they react in a way that may restabilize the situation, and it may come across that they're lying, but they're not actually fabricating the events that happened. Next fact is physical force is rarely used in children for child sexual abuse. So physical force is very rarely used as a mechanism of harm or violence when the sexual assault or sexual violence or child sexual abuse is happening. And again, we're going to take some overlapping context. Going back to the 88% of time, it is known the person that's harming the child is known to the child and the family because there's already existing trust, rapport, in a relationship. They rarely has to ever get that physical to engage in the harm or the sexual violence, right? You already have trust and rapport. And then when you put another layer of grooming and manipulation tactics, again, coercion, threats, all of those kind of things, physical force is rarely used in a correlation with the sexual violence, right? And just to say that doesn't mean that there isn't physical impacts from the sexual violence, but physical force, like I'm thinking about hitting, punching, weapons, all of those kind of things, that heightened level of physical assault is very rarely used as a mechanism because existing trust, rapport, and relationship. We also have to think about children, the power dynamics of children, especially bigger people, adults, older teens, etc. That person is physically usually bigger than them, right? So again, just by the mere size difference, children kind of are more likely to just again, and we have to also talk about um, what's it called? Trauma responses, but children are rarely going to be physically fight back. So physical force is rarely used, especially if the person is bigger. And then trust, rapport, and grooming and manipulation tactics. Physical force doesn't have to be the driving factor in coordination with the sexual abuse and the sexual violence experience. Again, doesn't mean there aren't physical impacts from the sexual violence, but physical force isn't like, again, I would like to say the gun in the violence that has been enacted on children. All right. We're entering a new section. We're talking about the realities of disclosure. So this is where you can actually have some tools that you can put in your toolkits and things you can use for like very minimal assessment. And we're talking about clinical assessment, supportive assessment when a child is disclosing to you about their experiences of child sexual abuse or the abuse and violence they've experienced. Before we get into that is one thing I want to note around child sexual abuse, noting the last thing I said around the impacts, especially physical impacts. Sometimes there is changes of behavior, sometimes there's general signs of stress, and sometimes there's no indicators that is perceivable to us as support people of the abuse that children are experiencing right now. And that is okay. We like to think of it as a range. Sometimes kids show really stark changes in their behavior, moods, physical impact, emotional regulation, regressive behaviors, all of those kinds of things. And sometimes that pendulum swings to the other side. We even see a lot with children and youth. Sometimes they lean into more perfection and things that people would see as positive attributes, right? And it could be an indicator. And sometimes there's no indicator at all. There is no change in their baseline behavior, their temperament, their behavior, their relationships with other people. And I know it's a lot to contain because oftentimes as support people, we're looking for something that's tangible. Okay, I can pick out these three characteristics to know that this person is experiencing this level of harm. We need these three indicators to know that this child has experienced child sexual abuse. And sometimes it might show up, and sometimes it might be obvious and very perceivable, and sometimes there are no indicators. And that's why a culture of check-in is quite important, whether you're a caregiver, a professional, a teacher, an educator, a counselor, a doctor, nurse, having the ability to do check-in in a developmentally appropriate manner will be able to for you to kind of see where that child's at without having explicit indicators. So something for you folks to reflect on. I know there's no chat feature, but I want you all to think about why you think it might be difficult for a child to talk about something they've been going through, and not just in a sexual violence or sexual abuse realm, but overall, right? You know, I remember being younger, and my parents would ask me, "How was school today?" And my answer would always be good. And I could have been going through a lot. I could have been being bullied. I could have, had a hard day. It was a hard pop quiz, but my answer was always good, right? So think about that. Even the most like positive and neutral kind of experiences of children and your relationship with children and youth, like how was school today? And their answer is good or same old, right? Think about why it might be difficult for us, for our children to talk about difficult things, challenges, even outside of child sexual abuse and sexual violence, and think about how much harder it would be now to now talk about it in the realm of child sexual abuse and sexual violence. So, to kind of scaffold on that idea, we're going to talk about why children may not want to disclose what if they have been abused. So, the first reason is that children might not identify what has been done to them as abusive, right? I'm going to bring some anecdotal experience. Like for me to really like even from a very general macro level, for me to really develop the ability to think about abuse and violence, I wasn't able to develop that ability until maybe my teenage year, my preteen years. As a 6-year-old, I used to think about things like, oh, that made me feel bad. That was icky. That made me feel sad. But the term abuse and violence, that large scale thinking and what comes with it, I didn't cognitively and developmentally, that didn't really arrive for me until like my preteen years into my teens. So most children where they're at developmentally don't have the language and the ability to develop that, right? They're not there yet on their developmental journey. They know more feelings. That made me feel sad, icky. Um, I wasn't feeling okay, things like abuse, danger, violence, that's something they usually develop later on in life. So we also have to think about why might not be able to identify it. And usually is a lot tied to where they are developmentally. So a conversation you would have with a 6-year-old is not the same kind of conversation you would have with a 16-year-old. Again, that developmental piece is a key holder in this. Related to that, children may not have the vocabulary to name what has been done to them. So in our children and youth program, Who Do You Tell? That's the program we have from preschool to elementary school age children and kids, we focus on feelings, right? Going back to what I said, they may not be able to put the language of abuse, violence, harm yet to the experience, but they know their feelings. They know that, oh, I don't feel good when you touch me there. I don't like that. That made me feel icky. That makes me feel gross. Even the language of unsafe and harm is depending on where that child is and the age group may be too big of language. So again, really understanding like how are we communicating and touching base with them? Are we using the developmentally appropriate language for where that child is at to understand their world and how they conceptualize and relate their world to other people? Next, for why children might not disclose, is children might feel uncomfortable, embarrassed, or ashamed to describe what has been done to them. Even at a very young age, we have the ability to conceptualize what's an intimate experience and what is for public consumption, right? So even at a very young age, and we're going through the developmental journey, we can conceptualize the two. And it's sometimes uncomfortable, embarrassing, and shame attached to even a 7-year-old talking about these experiences. Couple that with the language development and cognitive development, we're in a very interesting kind of soup of different things going on, right? So again, that's why at a young age, we talk about in our Who Do You Tell program that those feeling words of uncomfortable, was that icky for you? Did that make you feel like weird? Did that make you feel icky? Did that make you feel sad? Those kind of language can kind of conceptualize and help them relay what their experiences could be. But even at a very young age, children can know embarrassment, discomfort, shame. And that is very unfortunate to say, especially shame, because shame is like something I think most people throughout the entirety of their life find a way to combat, and is very profound to know that that starts at a very young age and they can experience it, and that could be a barrier for them to disclose what has happened to them, even to the people that love about them and care about them more than ever. Next is why children might not disclose, is that children might not want to burden those they care about by telling them about what has been done to them. So again, even though I consider your children and youth years your most selfish years, the years of the least responsibility, but children and youth are still not, fully selfish and just fully self-contained. They are sponges. They see what's going on around them and they don't want to add more burdens, especially to their primary caregivers, right? To their loved ones, the people that are more close to them. They're still protective of other people, even though they're in the stage of life where their primary focus should be on themselves. They're seeing the world and seeing other people's reactions to them and how the world is starting to move and groove. So again, they might not want to burden their caregivers. They don't want to burden other people. They want to add to people's plate, especially if there's other levels of things that are happening in the home. They might feel like they're being a burden, that they're not adding or making things better, they're making things worse, and then assessing people's reactions, they may want to pull back as, again, a protective factor, not just for themselves but the people around them. Next is children might not want to tell anyone because they love and trust the person that is abusing them and didn't want that person to get in trouble. Again, I'm going to bring back the stats of 88% of the time, the person that's abusing the child is known and trusted to the child, has previous rapport and relationship, and as well to potentially the family members as well. We like to say that usually parents and caregivers do not leave their children in a care or around people that they don't know or they don't trust, they don't have trust and rapport with, right? Parents usually have their children interact with trusted adults and people that the parents know and caregivers know as well. So there is love, trust, rapport, and relationship that the child perceives personally or in their family. So that's why they don't want to tell. They still love that person, right? That person can still be someone that they want to see. They love their coach. They love playing soccer. They love their parent. They love their cousin. They love going to Sunday school. They love their faith. They love all those kind of things. Again, it comes back to where that child's worldview is, right? And the child not wanting to destabilize things, right? And again, sexual violence is complicated in the way that because it's so relational and because it can be so close to home, it's sometimes hard, especially for children. Even adults struggle with this, and it's a human phenomenon, right? For you to extrapolate the relationship rapport from the violence that is being experienced at the same time. Those two worlds are intermingling, right? Especially with something like sexual violence, where the vast majority of the time, the person harming the person is known to that person. So it's hard to remove yourself from that relationship and just singularly focus on the violence when you, again, have love, trust, rapport, relationship, stability, predictability, community with that person. And again, we're going to talk about this a little bit in an intersectional way. Think about folks that live in an intersectional community or a marginalized community, where that's even so much more important, right? For example, children and youth that are part of the LGBTQIA community, racialized youth, all those different immigrant youth, is even more compounded in their experience because, again, there is not safety in the outside world. So their community, their family, the people in their network can be their source of trust, rapport, and empowerment. but again, it's complicated feelings, especially when violence comes into the picture, and they don't want to lose the love, trust, and community have, but they know that the violence is happening and it's happening consistently and repeatedly. So again, not getting people into trouble, not losing that relationship, not destabilizing the home, not changing their loves. If they love to play soccer and it's their coach, they want to continue to play soccer, and they kind of know that if I tell somebody, I may not be able to play soccer on this team again, and all my friends are there, and I love playing soccer. So again, the complicated world that children have is real. Children are not so simple-minded. Their worlds are big, they're vast, complicated with a lot of intersections, and that reflects in how they disclose and who they disclose to and when they disclose and if they disclose. So that's something to keep in mind. So the next step, again, adding to your tool belt with and your toolbox with how to support children and youth, we're going to talk about how children tell someone about sexual abuse and the abuse they experienced. So children like to talk about their experiences in different ways. So they're like, especially for you, this is a common one, like I'm asking for a friend. They actually may be asking for a friend, inquiring a friend, but from a friend, or asking about a friend's experience, or telling you about a friend's experience, or it could be coded ways to talk about their own, but create that separation. And that separation, and using these kind of hypothetical terms, is to create safety and protection for themselves, right? And also as a way to also see if you yourself are a trusted person to receive that disclosure, right? So as much as, they're regulating themselves, their needs, their community, their family member, the impacts of potentially telling and what might come next, they're also seeing and testing if you are essentially a safe person to hold this information, right? So there's a lot of things happening. And the first way children do that is by different ways of talking about it. So they'll say, my friend, this happened to my friend, or I heard this happen. Or like, especially with the young children, they can take you on a very fairy tale novel story around the world before they land in disclosure. But again, it's a way of self-protection, and it's also a way for to seeing if you yourself are a safe person to hold this information and do the appropriate things. And when I say the appropriate things, we're going to talk about mandatory reporting later, but I mean the appropriate things and being in terms of being an emotionally safe person and psychologically safe person to carry them through the process to where your professional or your personal kind of range is in that process of supporting a disclosure. Next is children tell a little at a time, especially for the little kids, the littles, they like to take you on a journey. And again, this is also a function of where they are developmentally. So again, this is just how they talk about life, their experience. If you've ever been around anybody under the age of honestly like 9, 10, especially those under the age of 6, that's just where they are at in terms of being able to communicate and verbalize their experience. So they'll tell you a little bit of time, and it might take days, it might take weeks. Sometimes it might take months, and they'll like run away. They'll tell you a little bit and they'll run away and want to play a game with their friend, or they'll get distracted, or they'll start telling another story. So they'll tell a little bit at a time. So that's a function of them being where they're at developmentally, and also in a way of kind of like, again, making sure and ensuring you're a safer person. So that ensuring you're a safer person may be more so into like the older years, the preteen youth age. And for the little kids, it's just where they're at in terms of their developmental journey. But that little bit at a time, again, is a way of a function of development, a function of making sure, ensuring you're a safe person with this information. And then a form of self-protection. It takes a lot of regulation to disclose any form of sexual violence, even for adults, right? So to say it all in one complete sentence, it usually takes a lot cognitively, emotionally, psychologically, even physically, right? So imagine how that translates to little people and youth and children, right? So it's again a way of self-regulation and protection, and also seeing who is safe to hold this information. Next is children might take it back. So we're going back to that false reporting rates, and do children lie about the child sexual abuse they have experienced. And again, it might land as a lie, as a fabrication to other people's ears, but it's a form of, again, regulation, protecting themselves, the people around them, including the person that has harmed them potentially. And just a way, again, not to destabilize what they know to be true, even if it hurts them. So again, children might take it back. They might take it back because they can see your reaction. Start, having big emotional reactions. You might start asking questions that might be interrogating in nature. You might say, okay, no, we have to do this, being very, very directive with your response. Again, we'll talk about reporting later and what the reporting process is, but they might take it back actually out of fear, like, oh no, I've said too much. Now it's out of my control. Now someone is going to do something about it, and I can't control what happens next. And again, because they are minors and children, we have reporting obligation that does put a lot of things out of their control, right? After the horse or the ball leaves the station, the horse leaves the station, there's a point that we have to take mandatory action. But again, their reaction is self-safety, fear, and thinking like, I can't control what happens next. I can't control if I can play soccer again. I can't control if they call my mom and tell her and what my mom's going to do, whether it's a tearful response or if their parents are going to be supportive or non-supportive. I can't control if I get to go do my favorite activity with someone that I actually love to be around, even though they're hurting me. So they might take it back again from a place of self-protection and protecting their world and what they know to be true around them, and might include the person that is harming them, and that is inadvertently. Next is that children often don't tell their parents first. And this is a hard word for a lot of parents and caregivers because naturally, like, you are, their primary guardian. Why wouldn't they want to tell you first, right? But again, children might test this first with safe adults that are not their primary caregivers. So think about teachers, think about coaches, think about professionals and all across different space, an aunt, an uncle. So they might test their disclosure first with a distant assault, a safe enough adult that is close into their life that they have that trust, rapport, and relationship enough, but distant from their primary caregivers, so they can it's a form of self-protection and to have some level of control in the process, even though a lot of the reporting stuff outside is outside of their control. So usually they want to tell their parents first. Again, that could be for a lot of reasons. The parents could be the ones that are complicit in the harm or directly harming them, but oftentimes we see is from a place that they don't want to hurt their mom. They don't want to see their mom or dad cry. They don't want to see destabilization. They don't want to see that urgency rise up in their parents. So they'll look in their network and see kind of those peripheral adults, whether it's coaches, aunts, uncles, older cousins, and to test their disclosures, parents of their friends, and test their disclosure there first before he goes to the parent. So again, children often tell the parents first. Doesn't mean they're not telling trusted adults. It just means, again, that's primarily not going to the parents first. Um, in the next section is how we're going to support children who have disclosed sexual abuse. So these are our key messages. So we want to ground everybody first and always in these key messages when somebody's disclosing, especially children. So the first thing is, I believe you. It's not your fault and your feelings are normal. So I often say that we want you to get at the essence of these messages, but say in your own way that makes it human, right? You have the trust rapport relationship or interaction with that child, right? We don't want you to be robotic and read off a script, but we really want you to have that human interaction, because this is a very human experience that really requires humanity first and protocol second. So we really want you to leave with your humanity with, I believe you, it's not your fault and your feelings are normal. As we said earlier, that even at a very young age, children are starting to conceptualize shame and self-blame, right? So hearing something like, it's not your fault, even to a 6-year-old, right? Even though they don't have that robust vocabulary, that could be a life-changing, supportive message that really can aid in that young person's support and journey of healing and growth through that experience. So again, I believe you, it's not your fault and your feelings are normal. So in supporting disclosures, the first thing we have to do is listen. Listen, active listening ears, put down all the distraction, lock in, be present. Don't jump especially for young children, we want to fill in the gaps of what they're trying to say instead of actually listening to what they're saying, even though we may not fully understand it, because again, where they're at developmentally, their vocabulary isn't robust. But we want you to, again, be present in the act of listening and not try to fill in the gaps of what you think they're saying, but be present in what they're actually saying and their nonverbal physical and emotional responses at that time. Next is mirror their language, especially with young children, is very important. So if they describe their vagina or their vulva area as a flower, we use that. If they call their penis their caterpillar, we use that, mirror that language. Again, we can talk about teaching children and young people reproductive words and appropriate words to describe their body their anatomy, but doing an active disclosure is not the time. We're just going to mirror that language back. And it's actually very important to use that consistent language because that can be relevant when you report to entities like Children's Services. They need exact language, not a paraphrasing of, oh, she said flower, but I think she meant vagina. We want to use the exact language. And especially when we communicate and building rapport with children and children, especially, we use their language, right? We're not using it as a, time to, as a vocabulary lesson. We want to be present and human with them. And again, going back to our key messages of I believe you, it's not your fault and your feelings are normal. So again, those three kind of foundational concepts in supporting children in an active disclosure. So, so we're going to talk a little bit about our do's or don'ts. So again, quick do's, quick don'ts. This is a quick list for you folks to quickly refer to when this supporting disclosure. Next is don't. The first don't is speak over them. Again, for children, and it might be well-meaning, we just want to fill in the gaps. We want to like keep the conversation going. Even if it's silence, if it's a lot of ums, if it's even with the distractions that happen, especially with young kids, don't speak over them, right? Let them be present, deliver that information however they want to deliver that. Next is ask questions to help convince us. So we don't want to ask those interrogating questions. So those who's, why, where, how, those leading questions is not relevant. And also now in terms of like an investigation purpose, if it's a case that we have to report to Children's Services, we don't want to kind of taint that with leading questions. We leave the investigations up to the investigators, and we're just here to listen, mirror their language that they use back and the vocabulary they use back. But yeah, we're very cognizant of the questions. You ask open-ended questions, not leading questions to elicit a certain response and to convince yourself or even put narratives in the child's mind, even if it doesn't, again, chronologically make sense, narrative-wise, it doesn't make sense. We're present with that information and how to deliver that information, staying away from leading questions and going to open-ended questions. Next is react impulsively. So again, when anybody discloses sexual violence, especially children, is emotionally charged as a support person. We don't want you to be a robot and stonewalled and be like, yeah, yeah. And it's okay to show your humanity, but those big emotional reactions and those statements is what we want to contain. Because children are paying attention to us. They're going to help like, oh, I need to regulate them right now. They're having a big emotion, right? So now they turn from the disclosure to the support person because of big emotions or big reactions or statements we're saying. And another thing is that again, the big impulsive reactions can really, again, switch the roles that are happening and put us in a position that the children are responding to us rather than us being a support person and making them feel like they can't say it again. They can't disclose, they can't have a conversation, shutting them down and saying that, okay, anytime I tell someone my story, anytime I tell somebody a truth or disclosure, it's going to lead to something big and reactive. And again, children are trying to create safety in their lives. So again, that big reaction does not help at that time. It's okay to show your humanity. Say like, I'm sad that this happened to you. I'm really sad that someone did this to you and someone hurt you in that way. That's okay to say, but that those big emotional reactions are not helping the situation. And again, having a role reversal, especially with children, to feel like they have to take care of you or they're no longer safe to have these conversations with anybody else, even with people that they feel safety with. Next is give opinions or advice unsolicited. So this is across age spans. Don't give your opinion, don't give your advice. it's okay to do a safety check. A safety assessment is really important to know if they can go home or can go to the next location safely. That's the biggest thing. But in terms of opinions and advice, we don't give it. We hear, we collect, we support, we give emotional support and regulation, but we're not giving opinions or advice, especially if it's unsolicited. Last is promise to keep secrets. In terms of child sexual abuse and anybody under the age of 18, especially around mandatory reporting, we can't not keep secret. We have to now escalate this thing appropriately, whether it's like, for example, in a school system, most schools, all schools have some kind of policy around reporting things like this. And if it's in a familial setting, we have things with children's services that exist that we can't keep a secret and that mandatory report must be made. So this is Alberta, and I know AVA is a national platform. So please check in your province or your region to see what your reporting obligations are in your region. But in Alberta, every adult in Alberta that has suspicions of child abuse or neglect of any form is obligated to report to Alberta's Children's Services. So this is not the police. This is Children's Services. It's a separate entity, it's a provincial entity. And in some cases, they might liaise the police. So your obligation is not to report to the police, is to report to Children's Services. And in that reporting, they will ask for appropriate information and then take it from there. So that's why when you're reporting, oftentimes when reporting, they're asking for how that conversation exactly went. So that's why it's also important not to put words in that child's mouth. But again, check in your region or your province to see what your reporting obligation is. But I think throughout Canada, a lot of provinces have similar reporting obligations. Again, no obligation to report to your police or the RCMP. That is an option, not an obligation. So it can be very heavy when someone tells you about child sexual abuse. So one thing that's very important is to continue to take care of yourselves. You I often say you can't pour from an empty cup. And then when you're hearing things, especially from children, it has another layer to it, right? So again, take care of yourselves. Continue to engage in continuing education, like places like AVA and like places like CASA, to really know about tips and tricks on how to support yourself during a disclosure, to know more about educational services, to have increase your network of support. So know different organizations and partners you can refer to is super important. So I'm going to go over CASA services. So CASA, we are the primary sexual violence agency in Calgary and surrounding areas. We've been around for over 30 years and we have a myriad of services. So we're fully wraparound in terms of that. We have a support line. We have full counseling. So our counseling programs for anyone under the age of 12 or anyone over the age of 12, excuse me. Anybody over the age of 12 can access CASA for counseling, and that's for up to 24 free sessions, 6 sessions for support people of the person enrolled in our counseling program. Anybody under the age of 12 that wants to access counseling should go to Luna Center in Calgary, Alberta. We have education. So if you want to know more deeply about child sexual abuse, so this was a shortened version of what we usually deliver as a 3-hour program. It's very expansive, very thorough, and we have children's education and youth education across different developmental ages. You can access that. We are also community partner with Alberta Health Services, where we do have the sexual assault response team when we respond to recent sexual assaults in a healthcare setting. So any urgent care and hospital care settings in Calgary and surrounding areas. And then we also have our police and court program, which helps with the reporting side. So if you're thinking about reporting, you're currently in the reporting process or after reporting, we have our CASA team to assist you throughout the process. So we're fully a wraparound service. Please go on our website to discover more about us. I'm going to go past the survey and go here where we have our support information. So again, to get in contact with CASA, the main line is the 403-237-5888 line. And then we're also part of the Alberta One Line for Sexual Violence as well. And then federally, we have the 24-hour sexual violence support. So definitely take this information and contact us also for professional consultations if you have more questions or you want to get in contact with us or get more long-form education around our various subject matters around sexual violence. Thank you.
Femi, thank you so much. Such an informative and important presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I imagine that our audience members did, as well as will those who are watching this after the fact. Just a quick note to our audience members, my colleague Jason will be popping a survey into the chat for you. It will also get sent to you after the webinar. Just please do go ahead and take that. That helps everyone, including CASA and Femi, who do also need this kind of information from you. So please go ahead and take that. And then the Q&A is open, but while we wait and see if anything pops up, Femi, I do have a question for you. I had no idea, and I probably should have, of that shift in legal language to child sexual abuse material, which I think is so important because words have such meaning and such power about how we understand, respond, define these things socially, what it means. Are there other terms or words that are used in practice that might be better reflected if the government switched to using them like that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So child sexual abuse material is a huge one. So outside of child sexual abuse, the full like landscape of sexual violence. So words that are we use in service, and even some legislation I've caught up to it is we don't use the term rape federally in Canada. So rape is used obviously every day, but in terms of like legislation and service delivery, we don't use that term because it's very restrictive in this meaning. So sexual assault is more encompassing in different experiences that people can have that constitute that same harm and impact that what people would traditionally conceive as rape. So that's already in the Canadian legal code. So they've used sexual assault since 1983, I believe. So that's already steeped into our legal code. So rape, we don't usually use. Molestation is another word that's similar. In the word of child sexual abuse, I hear molestation a lot. Legally and in service delivery, we don't use that in Canada. That's actually more of an American legal term, but in Canada, we don't use that. And we don't use that in the service deliveries. Child sexual abuse is the term that encompasses that whole experience. Some other terms, rape, um, non non-consensual image sharing. So that is essentially that what child pornography or like sharing people's nudes without their consent. That's the term that we use in our service delivery, and also legally that's the framework. But yeah, child sexual abuse material, again, very new, January 1st. I heard about it late last year, so we're trying to adapt because also the framework has increased and how they criminalize it has also changed as well. So keep in contact with us. We'll be adapting our material to reflect the current legislation, and also look on the federal government's website to see exactly the specifics of that new law. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you can hear my dog barking in the background. I'm hoping that
No.
Zoom, perfect. I was going to say, I'm hoping that Zoom has decided to pull that out, but I think it's so powerful too because those words, the gravity of them means more. Because you talk about something like you hear about, I think what my students always call is revenge porn. But then you
Mhm.
switch to non-consensual, and it's very different. It removes that, oh, they did it because they were angry, they were jaded, this is a non-consensual sharing of something. Someone shared something they had no right to, and it changes the impact. Do you find something similar?
Yes, very much. And that's why I'm so happy they changed it from child pornography to
Yeah.
child sexual abuse material. Because when you hear something like pornography, whether it's revenge porn or child pornography, pornography denotes sex work. Sex work is a type of work that adults consensually engage in, right? So now we're blurring the lines of impact, right? And actual violence from something that is work that people can engage in as adults to exploitation, violence, and all of those kind of things. So again, that word is the pornography. Again, we're not moralizing the world. We're just saying that pornography is a type of work for adults and it's sex work and should not be equated with revenge, non-consensual photo sharing and the impacts of violence that happens with that, and obviously things with children, because minors and children cannot never consent, so they can never engage in pornography, they can't engage in sex work. So we should not conflate the language. Those are two separate arenas, and it takes away from the real violence and the real impacts and kind of like sensationalizes it, right? Like what you said, Sarah, revenge porn, they were angry, it's pornographic, it denotes like that this is a consensual thing that they're engaging in, when it's
Yeah.
far from that. And having the law is reflecting the language that's appropriate for that.
Absolutely. And now you see all the, because we are dealing with, I'll just say broader things that are happening, say, for example, in other countries around the characterizations of youth and what they can and can't consent to and what. certain powerful people are able to do or push under the rug. But I think even the change of the language, right, where sometimes, oh, it's a young woman at 13, or is it a girl, or like language matters. And I think that shift in legislation is a huge, powerful move toward acknowledging how important language is and what it distinguishes for us.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
And then as I was listening to this training, because this is not work I actively engage in myself, but I was learning a lot in terms of like how one might respond, how you would hold space for that, how you would deal with it in the moment or after the fact. And when you do trainings like this one, or even any of the amazing trainings that you and your organization do, what are those light bulb moments for people as they learn from these materials?
ooh, definitely the statistics. We start with that. I
That hit me like a ton of bricks for sure.
Yes. The statistics is like, oh, yeah, really locked in. I think, yeah, the most jarring one is, and we start with it and we leave with this, is the statistics. I think people can acknowledge and know that child sexual abuse happens, sexual violence happens, but the scale, it's what is hard for people to really sit with. And then the good thing of it, double-edged sword, is that it's a horrible reality, but it creates the appropriate level of urgency for the issue. That is not just those people, or it's something you turn on CNN and hear about, or you turn on global news and you read about, or you go on Twitter or whatever. It is, again, people around you. I don't want to say it's everybody, it's everywhere. So again, it's really a societal issue rather than a one-off, an interpersonal issue. So the statistics is a hard one.
I found myself, I was messaging a colleague while I was listening. I was like, "Did you know?" And they go, "I had no idea." And it just sits with you where you're like, I knew it was a lot. I had no idea how much. And it makes it, I think, a lot more real and a lot more powerful as you listen through the rest of it.
Yes, yes.
Well, I haven't seen any Q&As come in, but that was so incredibly informative and so helpful for me and for our audience overall, I'm sure. So just Femi, a huge thank you, and also a note to those who are watching now and watching later. Femi's actually done another webinar for us already, and we're hoping for more in the future, as have a few members of her organization. So please go to our past webinars, check those out, and keep an eye out for an upcoming podcast with Femi very soon. And Femi, thank you, truly.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And yeah, continue to engage with Ava and also CASA as well.
Fabulous. Truly, thank you so much.